Welcome to Newcastle, one of the loveliest and most beautiful towns in all of Northern Ireland. Located on the southeastern coast of County Down in the shadow of Slieve, Donard, Northern Ireland's highest peak, Newcastle is a seaside town that boasts both incredible natural sights and a wide range of history and things to do on its streets. On this walk around the town centre on a calm and gorgeously sunny afternoon, we'll take a stroll along Newcastle's roughly mile-long promenade, pass by the site of the historic castle from where this town is thought to take its name, and take in the spectacular sights of the Mourne Mountains from the pristine grounds of one of Northern Ireland's most luxurious resort hotels. Now, famously, Newcastle is known as the place where the mountains of Mourne sweep down to the sea, and among the peaks that we can see here is Slieve Donard, the highest mountain in Northern Ireland, with a height of 850 metres or 2,790 feet. As the highest peak in Northern Ireland and the 7th highest in all of Ireland, Slieve Donard is naturally a popular destination for hikers, offering spectacular views across the Irish Sea and the rest of the Mourne mountain range from its summit. We'll talk more about hiking up Slieve Donard later on in our walk, but many of those who do ascend the mighty mountain base themselves right here in Newcastle, a town where there's even more to do when you're not climbing a mountain, from relaxing on the beach to a bit of golf, shopping, and local history. There really is something for everyone in Newcastle, and so if you're already thinking you might like to visit this town for yourself, it's handy to see exactly where Newcastle lies on a map. As you can see, Newcastle sits on the southeastern coast of Northern Ireland's County Down, on a large bay of the Irish Sea coast known as Dundrum Bay. The town is just over 30 miles south of Belfast and 20 miles east of the city of Newry, making it an easily accessible and thoroughly popular spot for day trippers from around the region, who often visit to enjoy classic seaside entertainment like the Tropicana warm sea pools here, Newcastle's outdoor heated leisure pools that are often busy with people throughout the day. Now we're here a little later in the day after many of Newcastle's main attractions have closed their doors, but at this point of the afternoon, the town takes on an especially calm, almost Caribbean character that makes it all the more delightful to explore. Just beside the Tropicana pools, we find the sprawling Newcastle Centre, situated in a row of historic houses known as the Ansley Mansions. The mansions were built back in 1835 by the aristocratic Annesley family, and were later extended in 1860 into a large hotel, known as the Ansley Arms, at the outset of Newcastle's role as a seaside destination. Today, tourism, particularly activity and adventure tourism, is Newcastle's biggest industry, but there's a fair amount of history to be found on the town's streets too. Here, for example, there stands Newcastle's majestic War Memorial, dedicated to the locals who lost their lives in the First and Second World Wars, and topped with an eye-catching sculpture of a lion that was unveiled around 100 years ago. The War Memorial is beautifully preserved on the town's main street, but you may have noticed that the old Ansley Mansions are looking a little worse for wear, having spent many years as a community centre and tourist information centre, although plans are now in place to renovate the old mansions as a brand new leisure centre for the town, all the while retaining and restoring the building's fetching Georgian exterior. But it wouldn't be the first time that the site on which the Ansley Mansions stand has been redeveloped. When the Annesley family built their impressive seaside mansions in the early 1830s, it only came with the demolition of the building that had stood on the site for centuries beforehand, that being the historic castle from which this town takes its name. It's thought that the castle here was built around the year 1588 as a fortified seaside residence for a man named Felix Magennis, a leading member of the Gaelic Magennis clan, which emerged as a prominent force in Ulster and particularly County Down in the 16th century, standing as the chiefs of an area that occupied roughly half of the modern county. Around 250 years later, the descendants of Magennis sold the castle off to the Ansley family, who redeveloped the site as we know. But the Magennis fortress isn't the whole story when it comes to historic castles here. Over 150 years before the castle built by Felix Magennis, an older castle stood just beside us here, recorded as long ago as the year 1433. However, it was eventually demolished and replaced by Magennis's fortress, which gained the name Nkashlan Nua, or the Newcastle. And here, we're walking along the banks of the Shimna River, the principal reason why the castles were built here by the seaside centuries ago. Now the Shimna isn't a long river, at only 7 miles in length, and it flows from the slopes of Ott Mountain in the Mourne mountain range towards this point, where it empties out into Dundrum Bay and the Irish Sea. However, despite only being a short river, the Shimna was certainly significant in the eyes of those who were driven to build castles just beside it, and it's thought that the original medieval castle, or the Old Castle, was constructed to guard the entry to the river, as it gave access to the hinterlands of the historic mountainous kingdom of Mourne. Now, we find ourselves back by the sea, and from this point we'll make our way along just a section of Newcastle's long promenade as we take in the spectacular views of the Irish Sea, with the Isle of Man located just beyond the horizon from where we are now. But as we cross over the Shimna on this brand new footbridge, the newest of a number of bridges that span the river, there are even more spectacular sights to see along this river if you choose to venture further inland. Looking just a few yards further inland, there stands the Castle Bridge, built in the late 19th century as a replacement for the historic Crooked Bridge that spanned the Shimna here for over 200 years. And even further upstream towards the heart of the Mourne Mountains, the Shimna becomes even more dramatic, surrounded by dense vegetation and in parts flowing down at a vicious pace underneath even more gorgeous bridges, like the stunning Foley's Bridge, built in the late 18th century. As we mentioned, Newcastle is a seaside town first and foremost, but the allure of the Mourne Mountains is equally impossible to resist. Now sadly on this walk, we won't have time to make our way all the way up along the Shimna and towards the top of Slieve Donard, but if you are planning to visit Newcastle, do, if you have the chance, dedicate as much time as you can to exploring the mountains just on the town's doorstep, the Mourns not only standing as an incredible natural spectacle, but also an area of Northern Ireland that's steeped in history and legend. The Mourns are of course a key part of Newcastle's drive to promote itself to tourists as a premier activity resort, with hiking among the many things to enjoy in and around the town. But Newcastle in the modern day is also a place where you can really kick back and relax. Situated in a calm and beautiful area of Northern Ireland that fortunately escaped the worst of the Troubles throughout the late 20th century, the modern town is only a small place, home to a population of around 7,500 people. But in recent years, as part of the drive to continue attracting tourists from all over Ireland, Newcastle has undergone a number of changes that have only added to its charms. Here, we're walking along one of those most recent developments, Newcastle's gorgeous new central promenade that stretches all the way along the town's seafront and sprawling sand and pebble beach. Now the current promenade was developed only a few years ago, complete with the Estuary footbridge that we just walked over, but a long leisure walkway has existed here in Newcastle for well over 100 years, the town's first promenade opened by the Earl Annesley in 1898. This development came during what you might call Newcastle's greatest heyday, as the town developed from a fashionable seaside resort into a widely beloved destination for the masses, boosted by the arrival of the railways and the opening of a number of grand new hotels. Over the years since that first promenade was built, Newcastle's seafront has seen many iconic landmarks come and go, the old bandstand and gardens filled with fountains having made way for beautiful and pristine modern public spaces, and a number of desirable beachfront properties with stunning sea views. We'll return to the promenade again a little later on in our walk, but here just one street back from the sea, we find one of the most eye-catching historic buildings in Newcastle's ever-changing town centre. Built just a stone's throw from the beach, this is the old St Mary's Catholic Church, which operated as Newcastle's principal Catholic place of worship for over 100 years, from 1854 until 1966. in 1966, this historic church was replaced by a huge new church that we'll visit shortly. But this building remains as a symbol of how Newcastle rose into a major seaside settlement during the 19th century. Before this church was built, Catholic worshippers had to make their way around 3 miles inland to the village of Bryansford, the site of the nearest Catholic church. But as Newcastle began to grow in size with tourism and redevelopment led by the Annesley family, it became clear that those living here would need their own Catholic church. So St Mary's was built on Newcastle's main street, and it quickly became a prominent landmark in the town, extended with a new porch and spire in 1910, as wealth continued to pour into Newcastle with the roaring tourist trade. Having made our way through the rather snug churchyard and cemetery, we're now walking out onto Main Street, where we can get a better view of the beautiful old St Mary's. For nearly 170 years, the church has occupied a major footprint on Newcastle's main street, and it remains one of the town's most fetching landmarks. Historically, the church was neighboured by a school, known as St Mary's National School, but today it's neighboured on one side by shops, and on the other by the small but delightful St Mary's Hall. Originally built as a community meeting centre beside the church, St Mary's Hall has since 2018 gained a new purpose, as the home of the Newcastle Community Cinema. The cinema used to be located just to the south of the town centre in the old Ansley Hall, but it now finds itself right at the heart of the local community, and is open to all as a place to watch films, stage performances, and participate in community events and classes. After all, as well as the many facilities that you'll find around the town for tourists, Newcastle is home to a proud and tightly knit community, who are lucky enough to stroll along Main Street here and get a view of the spectacular Mourne mountains in the distance whenever they want. Main Street, lined with everything from houses to shops, pubs and amusement arcades, is often packed with people on weekends and busy summer days, and it has been for well over a century, even as the road has changed in size and shape over time. You'll also find many of Newcastle's longest-running hotels on Main Street, although in recent years the number of lodgings in the heart of town has gradually reduced with the growth in popularity of foreign travel replacing domestic seaside holidays. Now just along Main Street from St Mary's Catholic Church, there stands another impressive town centre church, this one being Newcastle Presbyterian Church, built in the 1900s to replace an older church of 1842, which was built to cater to the town's Presbyterian population, in similar fashion to how St Mary's was built for the growing Catholic population just a few years after. From this point, Main Street continues along towards Newcastle's grand old railway station, which we'll pass by a little later on. But in the foreground, we can see one of the main hotels in the heart of town, the Donard Hotel, opened in the late 1890s as part of that period of rapid growth in tourism in Newcastle. Now the Donard Hotel, which dominates the northern end of Main Street here, was a dramatic development in what was at the time of its opening still a relatively quiet and underdeveloped town, Main Street having been far sparser of buildings before the opening of Newcastle's big new hotels at the turn of the 20th century. Of course, large accommodation facilities meant that those visiting Newcastle could have a place to stay, and this opened the floodgates for the major tourist industry that continues in the town to this day. But we've now made our way off Main Street to take a brief walk down Savoy Lane, which leads us down towards the Promenade and one of the most striking buildings in all of Newcastle. This is Our Lady of the Assumption Church, a huge and really rather spectacular building that opened in 1966 to replace the old St Mary's Catholic Church on Main Street, which had become too small for Newcastle's ever-growing population and for the large numbers of tourists who would often pass through during the summer as well. St Mary's replacement here certainly spared no expense when it comes to size, occupying almost an entire block between Main Street and the Promenade, which at this point is a little more open, home to gardens and play areas, and a number of houses that look directly onto the seafront. Just beside Our Lady of the Assumption Church, which we'll talk more about in a moment, this part of Newcastle's seafront gives us an idea of how the town developed in the Victorian era, With this row of elegant Victorian houses, featuring a line of ornate balconies and beautiful front gardens, complete with palm trees no less, that really make you feel like you're on holiday. The Victorian seafront houses are just another part of Newcastle's attractive and really rather varied architectural profile. And adding to that variety, of course, is Our Lady of the Assumption Church. Built on a large scale to give capacity for a large congregation, rather than sticking with traditional church design like St Mary's, the building of this church took on an unorthodox circular design, a deliberate move that was intended to allow the congregation inside to be involved more closely with church services. It's an interesting landmark that's very much a product of its time, and the building is today listed as a notable example of 1960s architecture. But having now made our way past Newcastle's space-age church, we're going to make our way back onto the main street by way of Donard Place, so named as it leads up towards the Donard Hotel, which we saw a few moments ago. The opening of large hotels like the Donard was a game changer for Newcastle's tourist industry. But why exactly did people start coming here in the 19th century? Well, Newcastle, little more than a small fishing village less than 300 years ago, has the Annesley family to thank for its development into one of Ireland's most fashionable seaside resorts. At the time, trips to the sea were generally the pastime of the wealthy, developed with the spread of stories of the therapeutic properties of sea bathing and the growing fashion for socialising by the sea. However, as the 19th century developed, Newcastle emerged into one of the most popular seaside destinations in Ireland, which was truly open to the masses. The opening of Newcastle's railway station in 1869, which lay at the end of the line from Belfast, gave a direct link to this resort from the heavily populated industrial city, at the time the biggest city in all of Ireland. Seaside holidays were then within reach of hundreds of thousands of more people, and so big new hotels like the Donard were needed to accommodate the growing number of visitors who began flocking to the sea, where they could take a break from the intensity of work in Belfast's shipyards and factories. And this is how Newcastle really grew into the town that we know today, as countless new buildings, many of which were to be locally run hotels, flew up along the main street and elsewhere in town. And here, now having reached the end of Main Street, we can see towards what was Newcastle's spectacular railway station. Originally opened in 1869 as a rather more modest building that served as the terminus for the new Belfast and County Down Railway, the old station was replaced by this thoroughly impressive building in 1905, as visitor numbers continued to rise, and trains also began arriving along another line built from the town of Banbridge. With its station, Newcastle was within easy reach of the more densely populated eastern half of Ulster, but its fortunes wouldn't remain forever. Throughout the early to mid-20th century, the rise in popularity of buses and personal cars created competition for the railways, and so the Belfast and County Down Railway was eventually closed down in 1955. Today though, as you might be able to glean from the logo underneath the large station clock, Newcastle's grand old railway station is now a major local supermarket, with its fantastic exterior thankfully preserved as a reminder of that golden age of rail, and Newcastle's heyday. But even today, Newcastle has a lot to show for itself, and here on the northern edge of town, we're approaching the pristine grounds of the luxurious Slieve Donard Hotel, housed in a spectacular late Victorian building, and which offers some stunning views of the coast. We'll take a closer look at the hotel itself in a minute or so, but right next door to the Slieve Donard, just up the coast, you'll also find one of Ireland's oldest and most famous golf clubs, the Royal County Down Golf Club, which opened back in 1889. An icon of the game, the golf club here at Newcastle hugs the coast, and with the Mourne Mountains as a spectacular natural backdrop, is an effortlessly beautiful place for a round of 18 holes. In fact, the Royal County Down Golf Club was voted as the world's greatest golf course for 3 consecutive years between 2017 and 2019. Over its 133-year history, the club has hosted major competitions from the Irish Open to the Walker Cup. But before it became the prestigious venue it is today, It was one of the many popular activities for visitors to Newcastle hopping off the train from Belfast. In fact, every week in the late 19th century, there was a so-called Golfers' Express that made its way from Belfast to Newcastle, giving big city folk the chance to tackle the challenging and often windswept course, just one way in which the railways transformed this town. Up in front of us, however, is perhaps the most striking example of how the railways turned Newcastle from a fashionable seaside town into a major resort. This is the spectacular Slieve Donard Hotel, which opened its doors in 1897 and was built by the Belfast and County Down Railway themselves. Designed to be equally as magnificent as Newcastle's gorgeous natural surroundings, the Slieve Donard immediately established itself as one of Ireland's most luxurious hotels, featuring 120 ornate bedrooms to accommodate all those making their way to this town for a calming seaside retreat. Now in private ownership after being bought from the railway company in the 1970s, the Slieve Donard Hotel has always been a destination in itself, surviving through the trials of the Troubles, which severely limited tourism to Newcastle, and today remaining a highly sought-after place to stay. But during Newcastle's busiest heyday, the Slieve Donard, as the town's premier hotel, even attracted some famous names. Charlie Chaplin stayed here in 1921 when he was searching for the family of his late love, Hetty Kelly, while a regular guest of the hotel was the famous Irish author and poet Percy French, who penned the famous line about Newcastle as the place where the mountains of Mourne sweep down to the sea. And here we can see exactly what French meant by that famous line, which sums up the utterly gorgeous seaside town of Newcastle perfectly. But sadly, as we take in this view of the Mourne Mountains sweeping down to the sea, we've come to the end of our walk around this beautiful town. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Newcastle for yourself sometime soon.